There is a moment, somewhere between arrogance and catastrophe, when even the most sophisticated intelligence in the galaxy realizes it has made a terrible mistake. For the Veil Dominion, an empire that had consumed 47 star systems across 6,000 years of unbroken conquest, that moment arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, in the third week of what they had already begun calling the pacification of Sol. They had done their research. That was the tragedy of it, really. They had not swooped in blind the way younger, hungrier civilizations might. The Veil were methodical, precise. They sent their long-range observation probes more than 2 centuries before their fleet ever broke through the heliopause, and those probes cataloged everything. They watched human beings fight one another over scraps of land and ancient grudges. They watched nations rise and crumble. They watched the species nearly snuff itself out on at least 4 separate occasions. Twice through plague, once through climate inaction that bordered on mass suicide, and once through a weapon standoff so absurd that Veil historians, reviewing the footage, reportedly burst into something approximating laughter. They watched a civilization that seemed, by every reasonable metric, to be perpetually on the verge of destroying itself. The conclusion written into Fleet Admiral Cienerat's mission brief was clean and confident: Homo sapiens. A juvenile, fractious species demonstrating high internal aggression and negligible cooperative capacity. Technological capability: pre-interstellar, nuclear-armed but doctrinally fragmented. Resistance probability upon first contact: 12%. Organized resistance sustained beyond 30 planetary rotations: 0.4%. Cienerat had read that brief 3 times. She had felt the particular warmth of certainty settle into her chest. She had slept well the night before the fleet crossed the orbit of their outermost world. The dossier was thorough. The intelligence was solid. The humans, her analysts assured her, had never once, not in all their recorded history, managed to fully cooperate on anything. What the probes had failed to calculate was the one variable that made all the other data irrelevant. They had watched humanity fight itself. They had watched it bleed and fracture and stumble. But they had never, not once in 200 years of careful observation, shown humanity something worth uniting against. They had watched wolves snap at each other across the den, and concluded that wolves were weak. They had not considered what happens when something from outside the den steps through the door. The first Veil cruiser to enter visual range of Earth's orbital defense grid was named the Eternal Persistence. It would, within 11 hours, become the first Veil ship in 6,000 years of conquest to be destroyed before it could complete a single firing solution. The crew of 32 Veil warriors, each one a decorated veteran of campaigns against species that had fought back with considerably more sophistication, did not survive. The weapon that destroyed them was not some exotic alien technology unearthed from a ruin. It was not an AI. It was not even particularly elegant. It was a kinetic strike platform that 3 separate human nations that had been trading diplomatic insults with each other just 8 weeks earlier, had quietly, cooperatively, and with considerable professional competence, assembled in orbit during the 72 hours between first detection of the Veil fleet and its arrival. Cienerat watched the feed from the forward sensor buoy and felt that warmth of certainty begin, slowly, to cool. She called up the mission brief again. She read the 0.4% figure. She looked at the expanding debris field where her lead cruiser had been. Then she turned to her tactical officer, and she asked a question that no Veil fleet commander had asked in over a millennium of operations. "How long until they can reload?" The answer, delivered 11 seconds later, was, "They already have." The war had not yet been declared. No ultimatum had been issued. No communication had been exchanged. And already, humanity had done something the Veil had classified as statistically impossible. It had looked up, seen the shape of a common enemy framed against the stars, and agreed. The Veil had a word for species that punched above their weight. It translated, roughly, as fortunate noise, the idea that some civilizations, through sheer statistical accident, managed to appear dangerous for slightly longer than their actual capabilities warrant. Every conquest had produced at least one engagement that looked, briefly, like resistance. The Veil had learned not to be alarmed by fortunate noise. They had learned to wait it out. What Cianera began to understand, somewhere around hour 18 of the engagement, was that humanity was not producing fortunate noise. Humanity was producing something the Veil tactical lexicon did not have a word for, a kind of organized, adaptive, infuriatingly creative resistance that seemed to strengthen rather than degrade under pressure. The second strike package had come from submarines. Not space-based submarines. Ocean-based submarines, vessels that lived beneath the surface of the planet's liquid water and had been quietly recast, within the first 48 hours of hostilities, to serve as long-range launch platforms for repurposed intercontinental missiles carrying payloads that no one in the Veil intelligence apparatus, had anticipated would be used this way. The yield was less than a modern Veil warhead. The accuracy was far less than a modern Veil targeting system. But the number of them, the sheer cascading multiplicity of launches from a dozen different nations' fleets operating under a hastily constructed unified command, created a saturation problem that Cianeret's point defense grid was simply not designed to handle. Because the Veil had never needed to design for saturation. Because no species had ever thrown this much at them. The brief had said, negligible cooperative capacity. The brief had been written by analysts who watched humanity argue about borders and trade tariffs. The brief had not been written by anyone who understood what happens to internal human argument when an external existential threat steps into the equation, because nothing in the Veil's 6,000-year history had given them cause to study that particular phenomenon. The species they had conquered were either unified or they were not. They either held together under pressure or they shattered. None of them had ever operated quite like this, like a system that was designed to be chaotic in peace and cohesive in crisis, as though evolution itself had spent millennia stress testing the optimal configuration for exactly this kind of moment. There was a human general. Her name was Adiz Okonkwo, and she commanded the Pan-African Combined Space Defense Consortium, a coalition that had not existed as a formal military structure 60 days earlier, who sent a message to the other 15 unified commands on the third day of the engagement. It was 4 sentences long. It said, in essence, they are recalibrating. They did not expect this. They are going to try to create panic by targeting civilian infrastructure in the next rotation. We do not panic. Those 4 sentences were forwarded, translated, and distributed to military commands on every continent within 90 minutes. The Veil's infrastructure strikes, when they came, were met with pre-positioned emergency response systems, pre-distributed resource caches, and a civilian population that had, because their governments had told them the truth, decided collectively to be furious rather than afraid. You cannot break the morale of a species that has already decided it is angry. The Veil did not understand this. The probes had filmed humanity in grief, in despair, in chaos. They had not thought to model humanity in rage. Cianera requested a tactical pause. Her second-in-command recommended it be framed as a repositioning, for the record. She agreed. They had lost 4 ships. 4 ships, against a species with no faster-than-light travel, no directed energy weapons, no shielding technology beyond atmospheric. 4 ships against creatures who, by every intelligence assessment, should have scattered by now. She pulled up the original dossier. She read the line about internal aggression. She read it again, and for the first time, in a long and decorated career built on the certainty of information, she understood that her analysts had mistaken the symptom for the disease. Humanity's aggression was not a weakness. It was a fuel. And something had just lit the engine. Somewhere in the orbit of a gas giant 3 light hours from the fighting, a Veil intelligence vessel was quietly, desperately revising its assessment. The analysts aboard the Careful I had been awake for 40 hours. They had fed everything, every intercepted communication, every tactical adaptation, every improvised weapon system, into the Dominion's most sophisticated predictive model, and the model had, for the first time in institutional memory, refused to produce a clean answer. It kept returning probability distributions so wide as to be meaningless. It kept flagging variables it could not account for. It kept generating a specific error the analysts had only ever read about in historical documentation from the early days of the Dominion, back when the Empire was young and still occasionally surprised by the universe. The error code read, insufficient behavioral baseline. Species response outside model parameters. One analyst, a young xenosociologist named Preth, stared at that error code and felt something move through him that his people rarely experienced in military contexts, genuine curiosity. He had chosen his field because he found other minds beautiful in their difference. He had joined the intelligence corps because he believed that understanding a species was more powerful than destroying one. And now he was looking at data that suggested his own civilization had done something he had never thought possible, something almost poignant in its irony. They had observed humanity for 200 years and understood almost nothing about it. He began to build a new model. He went back to the raw footage, not the conflict footage, not the political failures, but the older material, the quieter recordings. He watched humans during disasters. He watched floods, earthquakes, the collapse of infrastructure in crowded cities. He watched what happened in the immediate aftermath. Not the looting that his colleagues had highlighted in their reports, but the other thing, the thing that appeared within hours every single time without exception. The lines of volunteers. The spontaneous coordination. The strangers carrying strangers. The absolute, irrational, biologically extravagant willingness to risk individual survival for collective survival, not for kin, not for clan, but for anyone in proximity who needed help. It happened in every culture, every geographic region, every historical period the recordings covered. It was not ideology. It was not policy. It was something else, something written into the grain of the species at a level that their political failures and their tribal conflicts had consistently, catastrophically obscured. He wrote in his notes, "We watched them wound each other and concluded they were violent. We should have watched them heal each other and understood they were indestructible." He submitted his revised assessment to Fleet Admiral Cianeret with a recommendation that had never before appeared in a Veil military document. It was not a request for reinforcement. It was not a plan for targeted elimination of leadership structures. It was a single word that, in the context of Veil conquest doctrine, was so unprecedented that 3 of his senior colleagues initially refused to countersign it. The word was negotiate. Cianeret read the assessment in full. She read the supplementary data. She watched, on a small repeating loop, a piece of footage that Preth had flagged, 40 seconds of recording from a human city, filmed during an early raid by a Veil reconnaissance element, showing a group of approximately 30 humans, unarmed, standing in a line between Veil ground scouts and a structure that contained what appeared to be young of the species. They did not attack. They did not flee. They simply stood there, in the full awareness that they could be killed, making themselves a problem that would cost something to remove. She watched it 4 times. She turned to her second-in-command and said, very quietly, "We made an error." It was the hardest sentence she had spoken in 30 years of command. It was also the most important. The message
Officers, the
came
time for
through on the
preparation is over.
41st
The
hour of
operation
the
commences
engagement.
now. Execute with precision.
Broadcast on
No
every
delays.
frequency the Veil fleet was known to use, in 17 languages, because humanity, even in crisis, could not quite agree on which single language to use for its first official communication to an alien civilization, and so had decided to use all of them simultaneously. The message was composed by a committee of 7 individuals who had been locked in a room together for 6 hours, representing governments that would, under ordinary circumstances, have been unable to agree on the time of day. The final text was a masterpiece of constrained, furious diplomacy. It said, in essence, "You have made a mistake. We are prepared to discuss the terms of your withdrawal. We will not ask twice." Cienarat read the translation 3 times. She noted the phrasing. "We will not ask twice." Not a threat, exactly. Not a boast. Something colder than both. A statement of intent delivered with the particular calm of a species that had already decided it was willing to go all the way, whatever all the way meant, however long it took, whatever it cost. She had received ultimatums before. She had received threats, pleas, negotiations, offers of tribute, expressions of surrender. She had never received something that felt quite like this. Something that read less like a communication between adversaries and more like a patient explanation offered to someone who had stumbled into the wrong room. She convened her senior staff. The discussion was long and, for the first time in this campaign, genuinely uncertain. Her weapons officer argued for escalation, for bringing the full weight of the main fleet forward, for ending this quickly, for demonstrating that the Dominion did not negotiate with pre-interstellar civilizations. He was not wrong about the doctrine. He was articulating 6,000 years of unbroken precedent. She listened to him carefully. Then she asked him a question. She asked him what he thought would happen if they escalated and humanity did not break. What happened if they bombed the surface and the species, the infuriating, adaptable, irrationally cohesive species, simply continued fighting from the rubble? The weapons officer did not have a clean answer. That absence of a clean answer was, in itself, an answer. The xenosociologist Preth was brought into the briefing room. He presented his revised assessment with a steady, slightly hollow manner of someone delivering news they wish were different. He explained what he had found in the footage. He explained the concept of adversarial bonding, his term for what seemed to happen to human social structures under external threat, the way their fractious internal politics became, temporarily but completely, secondary to collective survival. He explained that the Dominion had, by attacking, done exactly the one thing guaranteed to neutralize humanity's greatest structural weakness. He explained this with the careful precision of a professional who knew he was describing his own civilization's mistake. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Then one of the senior commanders, a veteran of 11 campaigns who had spoken barely 3 sentences since the engagement began, said something that would later be recorded in Dominion historical archives under the category of lessons acquired at significant cost. He said, "We spent 200 years watching them and never asked the right question. We asked, can they fight each other? We should have asked what happens to everything else when they stop." Cienarat authorized the opening of a communication channel. She composed her response to the human message herself, declining assistance from her diplomatic corps, because she felt, and this surprised her, that it deserved a personal touch. She acknowledged the communication. She indicated willingness to discuss terms. She did not use the word withdrawal, but both sides understood what was being said. She sent it, and then she sat for a moment in the silence of her command center, surrounded by the evidence of a campaign that had been built on the most elegant possible certainty, and had collided with the most inelegant possible truth. The truth was simple. The truth was this: the Veil had read humanity's history, and seen a species that couldn't agree on anything. They had not understood that this was the precondition, not the permanent state. They had not understood that agreeing on nothing was exactly the kind of friction that teaches a civilization, over millennia, how to build something the moment it finally has reason to. The ceasefire lasted 17 days before a formal framework was agreed upon. The negotiations were, by most accounts, extraordinary, not because they were smooth, but because of what sat on the other side of the table. Humanity's delegation was composed of 9 individuals from 9 different nations, speaking through 2 translators, and 1 improvised universal interface built by a team that had not slept in 4 days. They disagreed with each other regularly, visibly, and sometimes loudly. They passed notes. They argued in hushed tones at the edge of the room. On the 6th day, 2 of them had what could only be described as a genuine dispute over a point of maritime resource law that had absolutely nothing to do with the matter at hand, and had to be separated by a colleague before returning, 20 minutes later, to present a completely unified position that gave the Vale delegation almost nothing they had asked for. The lead Vale negotiator, a career diplomat who had conducted treaty discussions with 11 civilizations, reported back to the Dominion High Council with a document that broke from standard format to include a personal observation. He wrote, "These beings are not what we believe them to be. They are more contradictory, more difficult, and more genuinely dangerous than our intelligence apparatus was capable of modeling. I do not recommend renewed hostilities. I recommend, with the full weight of my professional judgment, that we study them instead. There is something in the way they are made that we do not understand, and I am increasingly convinced that not understanding it is the most dangerous position we can occupy." The High Council reviewed the document. They reviewed the engagement records. They reviewed the cost: 6 ships, over 900 Vale personnel, and something less quantifiable but perhaps more significant: the first genuine dent in 6,000 years of unbroken certainty. They deliberated for 3 weeks. They reached a decision. The Vale fleet withdrew from the Sol system on a clear morning, measured in Earth time. It withdrew not in defeat. Or so the official Dominion record would later characterize it, but in what the diplomatic language called strategic reassessment. The humans, receiving word of the withdrawal, did something the Vale found entirely inexplicable. They celebrated, briefly, loudly, expressively, in the particular human manner that involves a great deal of noise, and then they immediately began arguing again. Within 72 hours of the ceasefire, 3 of the 9 nations that had formed the Unified Defense Command were engaged in a heated dispute about who owned the orbital platforms they had built together. 2 others were locked in a trade disagreement that predated the invasion by several years, and had simply been tabled rather than resolved. The xenosociologist Preth observed all of this from the retreating ship with something that had evolved, over the course of the engagement, from professional curiosity into what he could only describe as a form of affection. He wrote in his personal journal, a practice unusual among Vale military personnel, the following: "They went back to fighting each other almost immediately. I find this, strangely, the most encouraging data point of the entire engagement. It means the unity was real. It means it cost them something. It means they chose it anyway, for exactly as long as it needed to last, and then released it the moment it was no longer required. This is not weakness. This is precision. This is a species that has learned, through every catastrophe their history records, exactly how much of themselves to spend, and when, and on what." We mistook the arguing for inability. It was practice. All of it was practice. The stars above Earth continued their slow rotation, indifferent and ancient, as they had before the fleet arrived and as they would long after. But something had changed in the particular relationship between this small, loud, infuriating blue world and the broader civilization of the galaxy, something that could not be unlearned. The Veil had gone looking for an easy annexation and found, instead, a lesson that 6,000 years of conquest had not prepared them to receive. There is a line, carved now into the stone of a memorial on 3 continents, placed there not by governments, but by the people who had stood in those lines, who had refused to run, who had aimed their repurposed missiles at the dark and refused to be afraid, that captures it better than any diplomatic document, any intelligence brief, any tactical analysis ever could. It reads, in 11 languages, because they still couldn't agree on just one. We have never been easy to understand. We have never been easy to stop. These 2 facts are related. The Veil, when they eventually translated it, kept a copy. They kept it in the archive that held the records of every civilization they had ever encountered. They labeled it, with a precision that would have surprised them once, as the most important piece of intelligence they had ever gathered. They labeled it, "Do not try this again."